Somewhere on the grounds of Neverland Ranch, behind a set of heavy doors that hadn't been fully opened in over a decade, sat a room full of secrets. Not documents, not hidden fortunes. Cars. A private collection that once belonged to the most famous entertainer on the planet. Sealed away, untouched, waiting. When those doors were finally pulled back, what stepped out into the light wasn't just a set of vintage automobiles. It was a piece of Michael Jackson himself, frozen in time. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this garage mattered so much, and why it took so long for anyone to see what was inside. When Michael Jackson passed away in 2009, the world mourned a musical legend. But few people stopped to think about the physical footprint he left behind, the houses, the memorabilia, and yes, the vehicles. Neverland Ranch had already become a kind of time capsule the moment Jackson stopped living there full-time. And among its many outbuildings was a garage that quietly held a piece of his personal history. For years, that space stayed closed off, not because anyone was hiding something scandalous, but because the practical business of untangling an estate is slow, complicated, and often unglamorous. Jackson's estate inherited far more than fame and royalties. It inherited unfinished legal matters, years of accumulated debt, and a responsibility to protect a legacy that the entire world felt entitled to weigh in on. Every physical object connected to him, from stage costumes to vehicles, instantly became something bigger than personal property. It became evidence of who he was, valuable both financially and emotionally. And that meant nothing could simply be pulled out and sold off without careful thought. The garage, full of cars nobody outside a small circle had properly cataloged, had to wait its turn. There was also a quieter, more practical reason for the delay: preservation. Vehicles left sitting for years can suffer just as much from neglect as from use. Seals dry out, fluids break down, paint and leather can crack under fluctuating temperatures. The people responsible for Neverland's contents understood that once these cars became part of the historical record, they needed to survive in a condition worthy of that record. So climate control was installed, access was limited to a handful of trusted maintenance staff, and the garage was treated less like storage and more like an archive. It's almost funny to imagine a garage full of cars being monitored with the same care as a museum's rare paintings. But that's essentially what happened. And maybe there was one more reason nobody rushed to throw open those doors. Mystery has its own kind of power. As long as the garage stayed closed, imaginations ran wild. Fans speculated about hidden supercars, secret prototypes, maybe even vehicles tied to unreleased projects. Every year that passed added another layer to the legend. Whoever eventually decided to open those doors knew that the moment they did, the mystery would be replaced by something concrete. And concrete things, no matter how impressive, can never quite compete with imagination. So the wait continued year after year, until the estate finally felt the moment was right. When that day came, there was no red carpet, no press conference, no flashing cameras jostling for position. Instead, it was handled the way most of Jackson's most personal legacy decisions have been handled since 2009, quietly, carefully, and with a small circle of people who understood exactly what they were walking into. Estate representatives were present, along with specialists brought in specifically to assess the historical and mechanical condition of each vehicle. A documentation crew captured the moment privately, not for a splashy reveal special, but to create an accurate record for the estate's own archives. Those who were there later described an odd, almost reverent stillness in the air. It's one thing to walk into a garage full of old cars. It's another to walk into a garage that hasn't been disturbed in years, where the air itself feels like it's been holding its breath. Dust hung undisturbed on some surfaces. The vehicles sat exactly where they'd been parked, chrome dulled but intact, leather seats still holding the shape of a life that had moved on from this particular space long ago. One person present compared it to walking into a room where time had simply paused, waiting for someone to press play again. What followed wasn't a single dramatic gasp, but a series of smaller reactions, a murmur here, a soft laugh there, someone quietly running a hand along a fender like they were checking it was real. Some of the people in that room had known Jackson personally, as friends or family, and for them, this wasn't just an inventory exercise. It was a walk through fragments of memory. Others were there purely in a professional capacity, cataloging serial numbers and condition reports, but even they seemed to sense that this wasn't an ordinary appraisal job. Whatever they were looking at, it carried weight beyond the metal and glass in front of them. Once the initial shock wore off, 3 vehicles in particular stood out from the rest of the collection, each one telling a completely different story about the man who owned them. The first was a Rolls-Royce Silver Seraph limousine, and it didn't take long for everyone in the room to understand why it held pride of place. On the outside, it was elegant but understated, the kind of car that whispers luxury rather than shouting it. Step inside, though, and the story changed entirely. Jackson had reportedly overseen custom interior work himself, filling the cabin with gold-toned accents, ornate detailing, and a design sensibility clearly inspired by European palace aesthetics, the kind of opulence you'd expect from royalty rather than a recording artist. Under the hood sat a smooth, powerful V12 engine, more than capable of matching the car's regal presentation with real performance. It wasn't hard to see why, over the years, collectors and auction houses struggled to settle on a single fair price for it. Some objects stop being simply cars and start being artifacts, and this was clearly one of them. The second standout couldn't have been more different in tone. A Mercedes-Benz 500 SEL from the mid-1980s. This was reportedly one of the vehicles Jackson used for years as a genuine daily driver, ferrying himself between his home and the recording studio during some of the most productive periods of his career. There's something quietly moving about that idea, that some of the biggest songs in modern music history might have first taken shape as half-formed melodies hummed inside this very car, with nobody watching, no cameras, no fans, just an artist alone with his thoughts on a familiar drive. Eventually, rather than letting the car sit unused, Jackson reportedly passed it along as a gift to a family member, a small, human gesture completely at odds with the larger-than-life image most of the world associated with him. The third vehicle carried a different kind of significance altogether, cultural rather than personal. A vintage 1950s Cadillac Fleetwood, this particular car had apparently spent time in front of film cameras long before it ever belonged to Jackson, having been used in a well-known Hollywood production from the era. It wasn't the flashiest vehicle in the garage, nor the most powerful, but it carried a kind of old-world elegance that made it stand apart. Owning a piece of cinema history alongside a fleet of luxury vehicles said something about Jackson's taste. This wasn't a man collecting purely for horsepower or price tags, but someone who valued story and craftsmanship just as much. Taken together, these 3 cars didn't just represent transportation. They represented 3 very different sides of the same person. The performer who wanted to feel like royalty, the private individual who needed an escape and a place to think, and the collector who appreciated history and craft for their own sake. But it wasn't only the polished, high-value cars that caught people's attention that day. Tucked among the more traditional vehicles was something far more playful, a custom golf cart, decorated in a whimsical, storybook style that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with imagination. It was clearly built for fun rather than status, the kind of vehicle you'd expect to see gliding across the grounds of a private amusement park rather than parked next to a Rolls-Royce. That single object arguably said more about Michael Jackson than any of the expensive cars around it. Here was a man who spent his childhood almost entirely under professional pressure, rehearsing and performing from an age when most kids are simply learning to ride bikes. It's not hard to imagine why, as an adult with the resources to build any kind of world he wanted, he chose to fill parts of that world with genuine childlike wonder, not as an act, but as something he'd never fully gotten to experience the first time around. The golf cart wasn't a joke or an eccentric footnote. It was a small, sincere piece of a childhood he was still, in some way, trying to reclaim. Looking at the collection as a whole, a clearer picture starts to emerge. This wasn't simply a garage full of expensive toys accumulated by someone who could afford anything he wanted. It was closer to a private diary written in a language of chrome, leather, and paint rather than words. The regal limousine spoke to a need to feel elevated, respected, almost mythical, perhaps as compensation for a life that often made him feel like public property rather than a person. The unassuming daily driver spoke to an equally strong need for the opposite, ordinary routine, quiet solitude, a chance to simply exist without an audience. And the playful golf cart spoke to a deep, ongoing longing for the childhood that fame had quietly taken from him. It raises an interesting question. How much can a person's private possessions really tell us about who they were underneath the public image? In most cases, probably not much. But Michael Jackson wasn't most people. Every part of his life was so heavily performed, so relentlessly documented and mythologized by the outside world, that these private, unphotographed objects carry unusual weight. They weren't chosen for cameras or headlines. They were chosen simply because he wanted them, which might make them some of the most honest artifacts of his entire life. Once the collection had been properly documented, an obvious question followed. What happens to it now? For many celebrity estates facing significant financial pressure, the answer would be simple. Liquidate, auction, and move on. Jackson's estate, by most public accounts, faced exactly that kind of financial strain in the years following his death, carrying a substantial amount of debt built up over decades of extravagant spending and legal battles. Selling off a garage full of valuable, publicly desirable vehicles would have been an easy, understandable decision. Instead, the people managing his legacy chose a slower, more deliberate path. Rather than treating the cars purely as assets to be converted into cash, they were treated as part of a larger inheritance meant to be preserved for Jackson's children. The reasoning wasn't about squeezing every possible dollar out of every possession. It was about giving his kids a chance, once they were old enough, to decide for themselves what should happen to the physical remnants of their father's life. That's not a decision driven purely by finance. It's a decision driven by the recognition that some things matter more than immediate profit. Memory, continuity, and the simple right of a family to make choices about their own history rather than have it dictated by outside pressure. It's worth sitting with that decision for a moment because it says something meaningful about how complicated legacy management really is. On one hand, you have practical obligations, debts to settle, taxes to pay, contracts to honor. On the other hand, you have deeply human considerations. Children who lost their father far too young, a public that never stopped watching, and a body of work and personal history that deserved more care than a quick-fire sale. Balancing those two sides isn't easy, and reasonable people can certainly debate whether the estate got every decision right over the years. But choosing patience over profit, at least in the case of this garage, reflects an approach that prioritized the family's long-term interests over a short-term payday. In the end, what makes this story compelling isn't really about horsepower figures or auction estimates, even though those details are interesting on their own. It's about what happens when a deeply private space connected to an extraordinarily public person is finally allowed to be seen. For years, the world only had access to Michael Jackson the performer, the moonwalk, the glove, the album sales, the headlines both dazzling and difficult. This garage offered something rare, a glimpse of Michael Jackson, the private individual, making small, personal choices nobody was ever meant to analyze or judge. Maybe that's the real takeaway here. Public figures, especially ones as scrutinized as Jackson was throughout his life, rarely get the chance to simply exist without commentary. Every outfit, every statement, every relationship became a story dissected by strangers. But a locked garage, filled with cars chosen for reasons only he fully understood, offered him something the rest of his life almost never did: privacy. And maybe that's exactly why, all these years later, people find this story so moving. It's not just about cars. It's about catching a rare, unfiltered look at who someone really was when nobody was watching at all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments what surprised you most, and stick around for more.